Boy, we mentioned a whole bunch of different ways of communicating. One of them, of course, is visual. We're really visual as a species. Obviously, there's a lot of animals that aren't. Cave salamander, for example. But in terms of visual communication, well, why is it so advantageous? Anybody? Well, you can read that up there, but I mean, just think about if you were blind, right? I mean, you can see right there. So it's transmitted instantaneously, carry a large amount of information. So just think about the poison dart frogs. They don't even have to think about what they're transmitting. It's right on them. Kind of like Halloween, right? It can be highly directional, or it can just be general. And it can be done with a kind of a passive anatomical display. Color, antlers, things like that. Now, of course, you can also do it with an active display as well. So it doesn't really matter, but it's, I mean, we have a wonderful visual system. It's not quite as good as, let's say, a lot of songbirds or birds in general, but it's pretty good. Obviously, if you're in a dense forest and you can't see beyond 10 feet or whatever, visual displays aren't going to do you much good. But out in open habitat, obviously you can see a long distance. And just think about a lot of American Indians in the Southwest. The Anasazi, they had all these, I guess they were kind of ceremonial areas, but they used to build big bonfires, and they were, like 10 miles apart. And so they could actually communicate that way as well. They're blocked by interference. And then, of course, in low light conditions at night, doesn't really work, does it? So, who likes blackberries? Who doesn't? God, I got such. Okay, now not the kind of blackberries you buy in the store, the kind you go pick. Have you ever picked blackberries?
Yeah, our garden.
Okay. Anybody else? You have? So if you live in a blackberry area, I mean, you can get there. Well, you can't stop them from growing. So when I lived up in Washington, we used to lay planks out on top of, this huge area of blackberry bushes. I mean, you can just get them. They're wonderful. They obviously they change color when they're ripe. So of course this isn't an animal making a visual communication; it's a plant. But the animal responds to it just as the animal signaler and receiver would. So in this case, the visual signal is an honest signal, and it's beneficial in terms of fitness for both parties. What do the plants get in terms of getting eaten by dispersal? Right. And then, of course, the animal gets a nutritional benefit, like me. So once I get on a blackberry patch, I'm pretty much done for the rest of the day. Okay. Now the same thing happens with flowers and plants, where they rely on pollinators. In fact, plants do all sorts of signaling, including deception, as we'll see later on. Okay, so in addition, birds are able to see in the UV spectrum. And a lot of these fruits actually kind of show up in the UV spectrum, and so they can see them. I mean, they see it. It's just a visual spectrum. You can see it, but at the same time, they certainly can see. And it also it tells individuals not only is it ripe, but let's say anthocyanins. So anthocyanins are something that's found in plants. It's a pigment, and it's also nutritional, all sorts of things. So there's, let's see, house finches out here. If they're really eating well on plants, their head gets really red. Okay, otherwise not so much. So these black caps right here, of course, they're the receivers, and they can actually determine, you know, what's a good patch to forage on and all that. So definitely visual communication is huge. There's actually there's another one that's pretty interesting. You guys probably don't know what a kestrel is, but in case, it's a little falcon, very small, and they hunt for, well, other birds, but also small mammals like microtus. Like the prairie vole that we talked about, that the one species is monogamous, the other isn't. Well, the question is, how would a sparrowhawk, kestrel, actually determine whether this is a good patch to forage in for, let's say, microtus, for voles? Obviously, there's high grass, they really can't see very much. And it was always one of those questions. I mean, obviously you could trial and error, right? That's one thing. You could hang out over, and perhaps they have very good eyesight. They could actually see voles traveling the grass, you know, getting disturbed and all that. But it turns out that urine and feces from voles actually are visible in the UV spectrum. And so these kestrels can actually hover over a big field and see whether there's a lot of vole activity or not. They did this they set up a laboratory experiment where they brought voles in. They put things under UV light to see whether they could actually respond in kind. They did. So it's fairly well demonstrated that that the kestrels actually, that's how they hunt. It's not actually random chance they find a good field or not. Okay, now of course there's auditory signals. We kind of went over this previously in proximate causes and ultimate causes of birdsong. It can be transmitted in kind of inconspicuous habitats. So who cares whether there's lots of trees? It'll carry over a distance depending on the kind of characteristics of the sound. Obviously it can be used 24/7. It's fast and immediate. It can relay a lot of important information, as we looked at the last time. Of course, in dense habitats, there's some attenuation problems. That mean it kind of fades out depending on the actual frequency and amplitude and all that. Distorts over a distance. It only works at the present. But as we talked about the last time, you often find birds with certain songs in certain habitats that carry better, let's say in dense forests versus open habitat. In fact, we looked at great tits in Europe that are found in all sorts of different areas, and it turns out that they actually have somewhat different songs in terms of the kind of habitat that they're in. Okay, so we talked about this. One hypothesis for birdsong is territory and dealing with rivals. And in fact, if we, one of the predictions would be that if you, let's say, put up a speaker, you would actually see fewer intrusions if it was a song from the species you're looking at versus some control, right? And then the other hypothesis, these aren't mutually exclusive. It's mate attraction. Let's see, females respond more strongly, so the mean distance in terms of these white crowns, how close they come in, the females actually come in to, let's say, a playback. And then the mean trill rate in terms of how they respond to that. And then in this Cassin's finch, which is related to the house finch around here, they did some things where they actually removed Cassin's finches and then put them back. And it showed, let's see, mean song length in terms of, what was it? So they were, the male was present, and then absent. No, that doesn't make sense. Anyway, I'll look it up. It's in the book. So obviously, we know that birds, female birds respond to song as well as visual cues. Now, a lot of animals use chemicals, olfactory. We do too. We use olfactory cues, of course, in terms of what they're determining whether food is good or bad. In terms of olfactory signaling, there's advantages. First of all, when you signal this way, you actually don't have to be present. All you have to do is mark a territory, and then you leave, and it's pretty well marked out who's there. It can transmit any time. It can transmit somewhat over distances, depending on, like a lot of insects actually, are very, very sensitive to chemical signals over a long area, long distance. It also lasts longer, so it's doesn't have the problem that auditory and visual signals have. And you can communicate, in a sense, into the future. Obviously, it dissipates over time. If using it to mark a territory, you must return and remark, that sorts of stuff. Oh, by the way, all these signals can be used, let's say, by antagonists, predators, or parasites that mimic a lot of these different ways of signals, especially chemical, to, let's say, deceive the receiver. So we'll look at that eventually as well. These are naked mole rats. They're in South Africa. Does everybody know what a social insect is? Or eusociality? No? Yes? Okay. Well, bees are a eusocial insect. There's one breeding female, sometimes more, but in other bees, but usually one. There's a very strict caste system in terms of hierarchy, the queen, the different workers, including, so the females are the workers, but you get females that actually develop over time. So in the beginning, they might be really good foragers. Once they get to be in their decrepit old age, they're usually working around the brood instead. And then, of course, you have males. Now, in both of these species, reproductive success means that you can't let any other individual breed. In mole rats, the queen does it. They suppress reproduction in other workers the same way, actually, as honeybees do with a pheromone. So the naked mole rat queen releases a reproductive suppression pheromone to inhibit reproduction. And then, in case that doesn't work, if she determines in any way that one of the workers is actually trying to breed, then she'll kick the ass out of them. Okay, so she won't stand for it. In bees, same thing. There's this pheromone that does suppress reproduction in all the sister workers, not the males, not the drones. Now, it turns out in social insects like this, they're haplodiploidy. So, in essence, the female workers are actually more closely related to each other than they would be to their own offspring. Because the male is haploid, comes directly from the queen, so has the queen's chromosomes. And then they mate with the queen, who's diploid. So they can get one of two different chromosomes. And so it turns out that for the workers, it wouldn't be a good deal. This is has to do, of course, with ultimate reasons, but they'd actually be losing fitness if they actually bred versus help their sisters raise their new sisters. Okay? Look a little, do you understand? Okay, good. Okay, good. Now, insects really use a lot of chemical signals. I mean, the bees, obviously, they use visual as well. They do the dance and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, a colony has to be in homeostasis about, different things that the different workers are supposed to do, who's breeding, who's not, all that kind of stuff. And there's lots of different pheromones that the queen actually releases, and other workers do too. Some of the pheromones are actually, they're called primers, whereas others are releasers. So in this case, the primer is a pheromone that suppresses reproduction. And then there's others that are releasing in terms of a queen, let's say, might release a pheromone in terms of getting the workers to do a bunch of different things. So there's a worker reproduction, of course, suppression, worker activities, comb building, brood feeding, that sort of stuff. Drone attraction and mating. So she releases a pheromone for that. Swarm clustering. Let's say they're going to move to another colony or move the colony to another place. Retinue behavior. So the queen has a bunch of workers that are kind of like a retinue, or, well, just think about famous people. They've got an entourage, right? Same sort of thing. Except in this case, instead of, shouting, "I'm so cool," all they do is release a pheromone, and the same thing happens. I wish I had no, I don't want an entourage. And then, of course, queen rearing as well. Okay, so these are primer effects, these are releaser effects. Retinue behavior, entourage, swarming. So she releases a pheromone, it initiates this behavior. These are primary effects in terms of, well, suppressing reproduction, certain reproductive activities, things like that. Okay. Now, in a lot of cases, we'll do more so in a bit, but deception. These are Belding's ground squirrels, and it turns out one of their main predators are snakes, especially rattlesnakes. Even though it turns out, just so you know, in areas where ground squirrels are around and there's rattlesnakes, usually the adults are fairly immune. They've evolved on kind of an antitoxin method, so they don't actually die. Younger ones do, though. So it takes them a while to develop that immune response. But in any way, they oftentimes rub snake skin all over them. And so rattlesnakes, I mean, still, it'd be better not to get bitten by a rattlesnake, no matter what, whether you're somewhat immune to it or not. But they actually rub it on so that it kind of hides their scent. And so if you actually look in terms of tongue flicks, so you would predict that rattlesnakes should make fewer tongue flicks when squirrels are rubbed with snake skins than compared to only squirrel scent. So this is squirrel just by itself, lots of tongue flicks. Squirrel and rattlesnake way down here, pretty much almost identical to this rattlesnake. Yeah.
But don't they also puff themselves up to make themselves appear bigger?
In this case, well, let's say in this case, you know, they want to be camouflaged. So if they see a snake, a lot of times they do. In fact, it turns out that a lot of ground squirrels mob snakes. Okay, so they do. They puff themselves up, they kick dirt in the snake's face, all sorts of different things.
Yeah, I just watched a video where he did this, and then when a rattlesnake approached, he puffed up, and they said to make themselves look bigger.
Right. And then the
snake
tails
decided to go away.
Yeah, and then the tails also. What squirrels do, ground squirrels do with.
Oh yeah, puff their tails to make themselves.
Well, they get bigger, but also it turns out they shunt warm blood into the tails, and then they raise the tails over their head and go back and forth. Well, rattlesnakes are pit vipers. They have these little pits, and they're very sensitive to temperature. And like at night, in fact, they don't have to see. Obviously, they use their tongue flicks, but also they can detect heat in terms of very fine scale. And so what these guys do is they put all the heat in terms of in their tail, and the snake is more likely to strike at that and miss than otherwise. And then, they did water as well. So they have all these different methods for dealing with rattlesnakes, which are a major problem mainly for their pups. But let's see. Let me see if I can actually find one. Yeah, I will. Now I've also seen there's these round-tailed ground squirrels down in Arizona, and I was once down there, and there was a giant, what was it? Gopher snake, Sonoran gopher snake, and the whole colony basically came out and kind of they helped it go away from the colony. Let's put it that way. They were all. What they do is they do the tail flicks. They also do drumming all along on either side, and so the main thing was they were protecting their pups for the most part, because they're also somewhat immune to rattlesnake venom. Okay, so tactile grooming. Now, obviously, there are other communication signals that you can do with tactile, like fighting. That's not exactly like grooming. But here we have, some horses, some humans, some parrots. One of the best ones
There's just music to it.
What's that?
There's so much music to it.
Well, they can put music to
I don't remember what documentaries you look at.
it. Yeah, they've shown it a number of different times. Pretty famous. Anybody ever take a hot bath during in the snow? No? Good. At least someone. Yeah. Well, a hot spring out in the middle of nowhere. Or a hot tub right there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what I need. Oh. Where am I? Oh yeah. Oh Christ. Okay, I know what it is. You know what, I forgot again. Okay. What they do is they use this ultrasonic sound. They have these basically castanets they send out. So this whole signaling thing has gotten really, really involved. Not only do they signal amongst themselves, but then there's this whole evolutionary arms race that's going on between bats and moths. You'd think that, bats, well, the mammals, they're more highly evolved, right? Not necessarily. Doesn't work that way. So it's kind of, defense, counter-defense, all that kind of stuff going on. The same thing that we see in arms races between countries. So we can also see this in ancestral signals that have been, if we put it onto a phylogeny, we can actually see, in this case, monogamy versus polygyny, co-option of aggressive display. This is a spotted bowerbird. And you can actually see how things evolved in this group of species. So at the base, we have a polygyny, bower building, and bower decoration. Let's see. Oh, catbirds are monogamous, so we'll use that as an outgroup. In other words, male and female nest together, and they both are necessary to get enough food for their offspring. And then, as often happens with a lot of reproductive displays, it's been co-opted as an aggressive display as well. So it serves two different functions. So if you actually look at a sonogram, you can see this courtship ska or scra and this aggressive scra. It's a little different, but you can see how closely linked they are. And we looked at this earlier with the talon locking and all that. And these are macaques. Instead of sitting in a hot tub and being nice to each other, they're going after each other in threat displays. Okay. Now, what's sensory exploitation? Anybody in here remember? Sensory exploitation? What does it sound like?
Taking advantage of some sense.
What?
Taking advantage of some sense.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So there's been a great deal of questions about how reproductive signals evolve. For example, let's say you had a bird species that then was separated. The original bird population had let's say a red head. The other population, they split. They're no longer gene flow going through. Now the red had to do with, let's say, a berry. So oftentimes berries are bright red, so it's been associated already in the past phylogenetically with food. And then apparently, or supposedly, the female, that red head is acting the same way as a stimulus to the female. So they've kind of confused two different things, food and sex. Well, it's not really confusing, we do it all the time. In this case, we've got these spiders, sensory exploitation, and it's you have the situation where a signaler is able to tap into a pre-existing sensory bias, and this kind of display for hunting has been co-opted in addition to this net stance. So it's predatory behavior. The males now do it. The females oftentimes attack the male but don't eat him, fortunately for him. And so while this is going on, while she's attacking him, he actually lays his sperm on these eggs and fertilizes them. So in this case, let's see, I forget what, well, this is a phylogeny, I forget what the N and T have to do with, but anyway, you get the idea. So this is a pre-existing sensory bias that is then used subsequently for a new function. This is another one. These are guppies, and in this case, guppies, let's see, female guppies originally were attracted to orange spots. I think it was because of food, or no, it's like, I know it, let's see. Oh yeah, right. I think it was originally for food, another food thing, and then now females respond very strongly to males with orange spots, even though it actually makes the males stand out in terms of predatory fish. So this is another example of one of those sensory bias, but also anonymous signal. Bright males have a much higher rate of getting eaten than dull males, but of course females like bright males. So the bright males that can afford the signal are the ones that reproduce. They last long enough to actually reproduce. The other ones don't. They get eaten before they even have a chance, or they're just dull, and the female says, eh, who needs it? Now, another thing that happens, we talked about super normal stimuli very, very early in the class. So if you give a goose an extra large egg, the female will rather sit on that than regular size eggs. So in this case, we've got these auklets, and there's a sensory preference can exist in current species that have never encountered a particular signal before. And so in this case, females will respond more strongly to altered males with large crests compared to males with short crests or no crests. So what they did was they started chopping off and adding feathers to various areas of the bird. And there's a large crest, a small crest, a breast crest, and then no crest at all. Okay? And you can actually, let's see, where's the, well, anyway, oh yeah, large crest. So you can see that frequency of sexual displays, even though this auklet in nature doesn't have a crest, the male doesn't have a crest, the females are still responding to it regardless. Hold on a second. Okay. Okay, so this is the same thing in zebra finches as well. Zebra finches, if you look at the bottom here, you remember that's a zebra finch. They don't have crests on. However, if you start putting crests on them, and different colored crests, you can actually see how the percentage of social time females spent with each of the stimulus type. And so they use different colored crests or no crests at all. And you can actually see it's all, and if it's not white, they hardly respond at all. But if it is a white crest, they respond very strongly. Now, in their evolutionary past, well, it might have been because female zebra finches use, like, oh no, you're not raising your hand. You're just stretching. Okay. Go ahead. I thought you were. I saw it out of my corner of my eye. Apparently, they like the females like to use white-colored things to make their nests. So perhaps it's a pre-existing bias in terms of why they respond to a white crest. Now, these are Scaloperus lizards. You've probably seen western fence lizards around if you've ever been out anywhere. They do push-ups. The males have these bright blue patches. As displays, the brighter the patch, the more dominant the male is. So oftentimes when they're displaying males to each other, the one with the dominant patch will usually, the other one will scamper away. And so here we have the same sort of thing. Lizards of the species, they don't have blue patches on the abdomen, but if you actually, let's see, put blue patches on, they respond more strongly. So they had, blue patches are ancestral, and then no patches in this species is derived. So even though this species doesn't have a blue patch, the other males, or males actually respond more strongly to males that actually have blue patches compared to others. So here we see aggressive response to a control, not very much. That's the red. White patches, same thing. Neutral response, a lot. But then here we actually see a blue patch, and actually they show submissive responses. Other males do to males that have a bright blue patch on them. So what's the panda principle again? Anybody? It's always you. No, let's pick someone else. What's the panda principle?
I don't know.
Okay. You ever seen a panda? You know about the thumb they have? No. Oh, okay. They
Oh, how their thumb evolves over time.
right. Now, tell me about this thumb.
Well, they were given that thumb for like the bamboo.
They
Like
were,
what they
who gave them the thumb? Sorry.
I don't know the specifics, but I just know that like they didn't intentionally have a thumb, and then over time it's like evolved.
Now, was this thumb that they've evolved for grabbing bamboo, is it one of the 5 digits?
No.
No. Okay. Now, it turns out in a panda's past, their ancestors were carnivorous bears. And carnivorous bears have to chase things. And so the actual thumb, or the first digit on any carnivorous bear, is very, very rigid so that they can run well. Okay? It's not flopping around like used for grabbing things. With the panda's thumb, because of that evolutionary constraint,
And this one belongs to bamboo.
yeah. So the initial thumb digit wasn't really available because there was evolutionary constraint in terms of how it develops. And yet, animals that were able to grab or somehow grab bamboo had higher fitness than others. And so over time, there's a sesamoid bone right in the wrist. Now, it's not a great thumb. It's a Mickey Mouse thumb. But it's good enough to get the job done. That's why people think that evolution by natural selection is kind of an optimizer. But there's a lot of, well, usually things aren't optimal, primarily because selection can only work on existing variation, right? You very rarely see some de novo trait that just pops up. It doesn't happen. It's always, okay, organism has all these different traits and anatomy and all that kind of stuff. And in a new environment, there might be a strong selective force. And so instead of creating something like a good engineer would from, right out of, they think about it, okay, what's the best way to do this? Evolution, there has to be some sort of variation in, let's say, in this case, the sesamoid bone, in terms of how good it is at, let's say, grasping bamboo. So it's also called the principle of imperfection. That's what Darwin actually called it. Okay. So this new adaptations, these are swordtail fish, and their ancestors were from platyfish. And their ancestors, as you can see, did not have a sword. But you end up with these swordtails that eventually did. And all they did really was, apparently, there was this co-evolutionary, arms thing between males and females. Males with a tail that had a little bit of a fin, that male got more copulations or inseminated more eggs than otherwise. Okay? So, and that goes for these females as well, even though the males in this case, X maculatus, the males don't have a fin, they still respond to a fin regardless, even though it happened in another lineage entirely. So in this case, is this using variation in fin? That's what selection was working on. There's always going to be some changes or some differences. In this case, well, you can see it with this one, it's a little tiny one, but it wouldn't really matter. Whatever it was, that's what's selected for the new fin. We've talked about fear of snakes, so we won't. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, oh God, it's late. We're done. So we're going to go over to CR 5329, which is the PC lab on Chaparral Hall, and we're going to start working through this data presentation thing. Okay? Yeah. What? Oh yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go over there in case people don't have computers, but if you have your own computer, absolutely, you can use it.